Have you ever heard a sound that both frightens and delights you? The knock at the door, a simple melody that can bring both a long-awaited guest and an unwanted stranger. For me, on that warm June afternoon, it was a sound that made my heart beat faster. I hadn't seen my grandson Noah in over a year. School, work, his life on the other side of the country in Philadelphia, all of it distanced us more than I wanted to admit. Today he was here, at my door, and I felt anticipation washing over me in waves. I glanced at the clock. 2:03 p.m. Finally. Trying to appear calm, I took a deep breath and straightened the snow-white collar of my linen dress. Everything was perfect. The warm scent of apple pie filled the air, fresh flowers stood on the table, and the lawn, despite its neglected appearance, sparkled in the sun. The knock repeated, a bit louder, a bit more confident. I almost ran to open the door, but stopped for a second, wiping my palms on my apron. "Keep it together, Madison," I whispered to myself before easily sliding the bolt and swinging the door open. There stood Noah. His smile, warm and genuine, filled my small world like the sun. He stretched out his arms to hug me, but someone else was standing next to him, a tall, lanky guy with skin the color of dark chocolate and a shy, almost timid smile. He looked uncomfortable, as if he felt he shouldn't be there. "Grandma," Noah said, nervously rubbing the back of his neck. It was a gesture I'd known since he was a child. He always did that when he was unsure of his actions. "This is my friend Darius. I hope you don't mind that I brought him along." My heart skipped a beat for a moment. I wasn't expecting any guests besides Noah. His words hung in the air as if he was afraid of what I might say, but I just smiled, forcing myself to handle the surprise. "Of course I don't mind," I said with gentle warmth. "Welcome to my home. Come in, both of you." Darius stepped forward, nodding his head. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured, his voice low and velvety, like the night wind. "Call me Madison," I replied. "No, ma'am." His smile widened, and at that moment, I noticed that he looked much more confident than he first appeared. His eyes, deep and calm, seemed to absorb everything they saw. They were so bright that they seemed to pierce through. When they came in, I immediately sensed that there was something unusual about this meeting. Noah spoke quickly, as if he wanted to justify himself right away. His parents are getting divorced and he had nowhere to go for the summer. I thought he'd be better off here than on campus. I just nodded, trying to process all of this. His voice sounded sincere, and I knew he cared about his friends. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that Darius was more than just a friend brought without warning. There was an inexplicable energy about him, mysterious and alluring. "Are you both hungry?" I asked to break the tension. "I made a roast, mashed potatoes, and I have a pie." "You're an angel," Darius said, his voice so convincing that I felt my cheeks slightly flush. It was a strange feeling that I couldn't ignore. We sat down at the table. Noah, as usual, chattered nonstop, telling stories about college, but my eyes kept returning to Darius. He ate carefully, his movements slow but precise, as if he paid attention to every detail. His laughter was rare, but each time it filled the room with warmth. That day started as a typical visit from my grandson. But even then, at the dinner table, I felt that this summer would change my life forever. The silence in the house was deafening. That special silence that envelops a space when guests retreat to their rooms, and you're left alone with your thoughts. But this night was different. It was filled with sounds. The soft rustling of leaves outside the window. The ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. But the main one was muffled laughter. He was laughing. Darius. He was sitting on the porch with Noah. Through the slightly open window, I could hear their voices, snippets of conversations, and the rare, deep laughter of Darius, sounding like it belonged to someone who knows more than they say. I stood at the sink, monotonously wiping an already clean plate, but my attention was completely absorbed by these sounds. His voice filled the rooms, vibrated, finding a response within me, and I caught myself waiting for him to speak again. "This is silly, Madison," I mentally scolded myself. "He's just a young man, a friend of your grandson." But inside me, a sweet, sharp, and completely new anxiety was growing. When the clock struck midnight, I decided it was time to go to bed. But instead, I found myself at the door of my bedroom, pausing in front of the mirror. The lamplight was soft, dim enough to smooth the lines on my face. I looked at my reflection, those eyes with a slight web of wrinkles, silver strands peeking through the dark hair. Was there something there that could attract a young man's attention? The thought was absurd, yet it wouldn't leave me. I heard the porch door slam shut. Noah, grumbling something to himself, walked past my room and disappeared into his. But where was Darius? Trying not to make noise, I stepped into the hallway, feeling the slight chill of the wooden floor under my bare feet. The light in the kitchen was still on. I stopped at the doorframe and peeked inside. He was sitting at the table. In one hand, a mug. In the other, a book I had left on the coffee table. His t-shirt was slightly rumpled, and his dreads, which he had apparently just let down, lay in free curls on his shoulders. It was a picture of tranquility, but something in his pose seemed vulnerable. I didn't expect to see him like this. "Late for reading, isn't it?" I said, breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. Deep, dark, they seemed to search for something within me. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, smiling. "It's too quiet here. I'm used to the noise of the campus." I smiled back and moved closer. My hand slid across the wooden surface of the table as I sat down opposite him. "It's rarely noisy here. I think that's part of the charm," I said, feeling my own silence becoming more apparent in his presence. He nodded, setting the mug on the table. "This place reminds me of home. My grandmother had a similar house in Georgia. She always kept it warm, just like you." I lowered my eyes, feeling his words penetrating deeper than I expected. "And how is she?" I asked. "She died when I was 10, he said, his voice softer. "But those years I spent with her were the best. She used to say that a home isn't just walls, it's the people who fill it." Those words lingered in the air, filling the void between us. I saw a shadow of loss flicker in his eyes, and before I could think, my hand rested on his. It was instinctive, as if I was trying to share some of my warmth. "Here, you will always be a welcome guest," I said, feeling the tension in the room growing. He looked at me, his gaze so open that I felt a slight flutter. "Thank you, Miss Madison. That means a lot to me." His hand squeezed mine for a moment before he let it go. It was a brief touch, but there was a connection in it that I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Lying in my bed, I listened to the silence, but it was no longer the same. It was filled with memories, a glance, a touch, a voice. My thoughts wandered, and the more I tried to suppress them, the louder they became. I knew one thing. This summer would be unlike any other. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of peach and pink. I stood on the porch, holding a mug of cold tea, and watched as Darius and Noah fiddled with my old lawn. Both were laughing, joking with each other, and their voices spread across the quiet street. Darius, with his back to me, handled the bulky lawnmower with ease. His movements were precise and smooth, as if he had been doing this all his life. The fabric of his t-shirt clung to his back from the heat, revealing the outlines of his muscular body. I looked away, feeling my heart beat a little faster than it should. "Grandma, are you checking up on us?" Noah's voice sounded, as he stood waist-deep in the overgrown hedge, holding garden shears. I laughed, trying to hide my thoughts. "Just admiring how my two boys are working. I didn't even dream that someone would want to bring my garden back to life." "Well," Darius insisted, Noah replied, shrugging. "Said your house deserves to look better than the backyard of a haunted house?" Darius looked up, hearing this, and gave Noah a mocking glance. "If you're done talking, maybe you should get back to work. The hedge won't trim itself." "Okay, Dad," Noah quipped, and they both laughed. I stood there watching them, feeling a strange warmth enveloping me. It wasn't just the joy of seeing my house finally come to life, but the feeling that I was part of something real again. The house, which had been quiet and empty for so many years, was filled with life once more. Later, when they finished their work, we all sat on the porch. On the table stood a pitcher of freshly squeezed lemonade. Next to it, a plate of homemade cookies I had baked in the morning. Darius looked relaxed, leaning back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He held a glass of lemonade, gazing at the horizon. "You know," he began, looking around the garden, This reminds me of the summer at my grandmother's. She had a huge garden. She always made me help with the flowers and trees, but I hated it. Seriously? Noah asked, raising his eyebrows. You look like you were born with a lawnmower in your hands. Darius smiled, and that smile seemed to light up everything around him. Maybe I hated it then, but now I understand how important it is. It's like meditation. You work, see the result, and it brings a kind of peace. I listened to his voice, soft and deep, and couldn't help but wonder where all that wisdom came from at his age. You had a good grandmother, I said, trying to suppress my thoughts. I think you learned a lot from her. Yes, he nodded, his gaze serious. She was a real light in my life. When she was gone, I struggled to find myself for a long time. But she always told me I should become the best version of myself, and I try to live up to that. I felt his words echoing within me. They were too close to what I had experienced many years ago. My hand almost automatically reached out to his, and I placed my palm over his hand. You're doing it, Darius, I said softly. You really are. He looked at me, his eyes lingering on mine a little longer than necessary. It was a moment when it seemed like the rest of the world had disappeared. But Noah, oblivious to everything around him, broke the silence. Well, now that the lawn is in order, Grandma, you have to admit we deserve a reward. I laughed, taking my hand away. Of course you deserve it. How about my famous apple pie for dinner? Oh, now you're speaking my language, Noah said, grabbing another cookie. I'll be looking forward to it, Miss Madison, Darius added with a slight smile. Later that evening, as I prepared dinner, I thought again about Darius's words, about how he spoke of his grandmother and what she meant to him. It stirred memories of my own losses, of the emptiness I had carried within me, trying not to notice it. But now with his presence, that emptiness began to fill with something new. Something within me was changing, and I knew that resisting it was futile. The silence of the night enveloped the house like a soft blanket, but inside me, a storm raged. I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the cool countertop, looking at the old wooden table where the pitcher of unfinished lemonade still stood. Only the faint light of a nightlight illuminated the room, and everything at that moment seemed unreal, as if I were in some prolonged dream. The sound of light footsteps on the floor pulled me out of these thoughts. I turned around and saw Darius in the doorway. He was shirtless, his silhouette sharply outlined in the dim light. His dreads, slightly tousled, framed his face, and for a moment I felt a chill run down my spine. Sorry to startle you, Miss Madison, he said with an apologetic smile. I just wanted some water. You didn't scare me, I replied, smiling. Make yourself at home. He walked past me, his movements light and confident. I watched as he filled a glass with water and then took a sip, tilting his head. His neck, strong and smooth, moved with each sip. I caught myself looking at him for too long again. Can't you sleep either? He asked, setting the glass on the table. I nodded, gathering my thoughts. Sometimes nights can be too long, I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral, especially when the house becomes quiet. Silence can be heavy, he agreed, moving closer. His eyes were soft but also watchful, especially when you're used to noise. We stood facing each other, and the distance between us seemed insignificant, though my feelings stretched toward him like taut strings. His gaze met mine, and the room seemed to grow warmer. At that moment, I knew we both felt something that couldn't be ignored. This summer has been strange, I said to ease the atmosphere. I didn't think anyone besides Noah could bring this house to life like this. Sometimes people come into our lives unexpectedly, he replied, his voice soft, almost a whisper. But maybe that's what makes their arrival so important. I felt my fingers tremble slightly. I tried to distract myself, adjusting the fabric of my robe. But he took a step closer, and my heart skipped a beat. You know you're an amazing person, Miss Madison, he said, his voice barely audible, but every note pierced me to the core. There's something about you that makes people feel at home. It's just years of practice, I replied with a slight smile, but my words trembled. No, it's something more, he insisted. It's something that can't be faked. He reached out, carefully touching my palm. His fingers were warm, and from that touch, I felt a strange calm mixed with excitement. Our gazes met again, and that moment seemed like an eternity. "Darius," I began, but he interrupted me, bringing a finger to my lips. "Don't say anything," he said. "Sometimes words just get in the way." His hand slid to my face, his fingertips gently touching my cheek. It was a tender, almost timid movement, as if he was afraid to cross a boundary. But at that moment, I realized the boundary had already blurred. He leaned closer, and I felt his breath on my skin. My eyes closed, and the world around me disappeared. His lips met mine, at first softly, as if testing, and then more confidently, deeper. It was a moment when all my fears and doubts vanished. Time stood still. His hands slid down my shoulders, pulling me closer. Each of his movements was full of care and respect, but there was also a passion in him that I hadn't felt in decades. I couldn't believe this was happening to me, but at that moment I allowed myself to forget everything else. When our lips finally parted, he looked at me, his eyes shining with warmth. "I'm sorry if that was wrong," he whispered, but there was not a hint of regret in his voice. "No," I replied, not looking away. "It was right." That night, we both allowed ourselves to be real. It was a moment that didn't require explanations. Just two people finding something in each other that they had been searching for so long. The night breathed silence, only occasional sounds from the street breaking the calm. The rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant barking of a dog. The house seemed frozen in time, as if every corner of the room held its breath in anticipation. I sat in my bedroom trying to focus on a book, but the letters blurred into a meaningless stream. My thoughts were elsewhere, only not on the pages. The scene from the previous night kept replaying in my mind. His gaze, his touch, the way he said my name, as if it were something precious. A knock at the door made me jump. I looked up, trying not to look like I had been caught off guard. "Come in," I said, my voice softer than I expected. The door opened, and Darius entered. He wore a simple white t-shirt and sweatpants, but his presence filled the entire room, as if he brought something more than just himself. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same hesitation in them that I felt myself. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you," he began, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I closed the book and placed it on the nightstand, gesturing for him to come in. "I'm fine, Darius. You're not bothering me." He stepped forward but stopped halfway, his gaze wandering around the room, lingering on the bookshelf, the old photographs on the dresser, before meeting mine again. "Have you ever wondered why some things feel so right, even if they aren't supposed to be?" I felt the tension in the room becoming almost palpable. His words hung in the air like a question I was afraid to answer. "Yes," I said softly, feeling my heart beat faster. "Sometimes life makes us participants in such moments, and maybe they're more important than rules." He moved closer, and I felt the space between us narrowing to a minimum. His hand slid across the edge of the table as he slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. "I can't stop thinking about you, Madison," he said, his voice strained, as if each word was difficult for him. "But I don't want to hurt you or do something you'll regret later." I looked up at him. His face was so sincere, so honest, that for a moment I wanted to cast aside all doubts. "You won't hurt me," I said. "Sometimes we're afraid of things we don't understand, but that doesn't mean they're wrong." He leaned closer, and I felt the warmth of his body. His breath was barely perceptible, but it touched my skin like a soft whisper. His hand carefully reached for mine, and our fingers intertwined. For a moment it seemed like time had stopped. At that moment nothing existed but the two of us. He leaned in, his lips hovering millimeters from mine, and at that moment I felt everything inside me screaming to take that step. But something inside me stopped. It wasn't fear, but the realization that we were on the brink of something more than just physical attraction. I placed my hand on his chest, gently pushing him away. His eyes widened, full of questions and hesitation. "Darius, wait," I said, trying to gather my thoughts. "This doesn't mean I don't want it, but I think we need a little time." He looked at me intently and then nodded, his face softening. "You're right," he said, stepping back. "I don't want to rush you. You're worth waiting for." Those words pierced me like a sweet melody. He didn't argue, didn't pressure. Instead, he looked at me with such respect and understanding that I knew I had made the right choice. He stood up, heading for the door, but before leaving, he turned around. "If something changes, if you're ready, just let me know." I nodded, unable to find words. When the door closed behind him, I was left alone, feeling my thoughts and emotions battling each other. It wasn't regret. It was the anticipation of what lay ahead. The previous night had left its mark. It wasn't a feeling of guilt or regret, but rather a sense of clarity, as if an invisible curtain had been drawn back. I realized that the years of loneliness, which I had accepted as a given, could be shattered if I allowed myself to. But allowing meant taking responsibility for what might lie ahead. The sound of footsteps behind me made me turn my head. Darius entered the kitchen, his image a picture of quiet confidence. His eyes, a bit tired from the night's thoughts, met mine. He paused for a moment, then smiled as if asking, "Is everything okay?" "Good morning, Miss Madison," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "Good morning," I replied, returning to the stove. "You're up early. Usually young people like to sleep in." He laughed, coming closer. "I've always been an exception," he said, looking at how I flipped the toast. "Can I help with something?" I looked at him over my shoulder, feeling a warmth rise in my chest. "If you want, you can get the cups. The coffee is almost ready." He nodded and opened the cabinet, taking out 2 cups. We moved around the kitchen with ease, as if these morning rituals had long been a habit. All the tension that had hung in the air the previous night had softened, turning into a quiet, almost intimate harmony. Later, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, I watched as the morning light softly illuminated our garden. Noah was still asleep, and Darius and I enjoyed the quiet moment. He sat next to me, his face thoughtful. "Madison," he began, and I heard something new in his voice, something that hadn't been there before. "I want to say something." I turned to him, waiting for him to continue. "This summer, you've changed me," he said, his gaze slowly meeting mine. "I came here thinking it would just be an escape from problems, but you showed me something more. You reminded me that connecting with people is what makes life real." My heart fluttered at his words. I felt my breath deepen and my eyes stung with emotion. "Darius, you gave me the same," I replied. "I've lived for so long thinking my life was already set, that all the big moments were behind me. But you made me feel alive." He leaned in a bit closer, and at that moment, that unspoken tension we both felt from the first day returned. But this time, it wasn't sudden or awkward. It was right. "Whatever happens next," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I want you to know, I'm here, always." I couldn't help but smile. This moment wasn't a promise or the beginning of something definite. It was a connection based on understanding, respect, and warmth that was real and genuine. As the day came to a close, Noah was already packing to go back to college. He laughed and talked about his plans while Darius and I helped him gather his things. I noticed how Darius kept stealing glances at me, and each time I responded with a slight smile. When Noah's car disappeared around the bend, the house was quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the promise that life could offer more if I allowed myself to open the door to it. Darius came up to me, his gaze soft. "Thank you for everything," he said, holding my hand. "This house has become a home for me. But more than anything, thank you for you." I squeezed his hand, looking into his eyes. "You will always be a welcome guest here, Darius. Always." He nodded, smiling, and slowly walked to his room. I stood on the porch, looking at the starry sky. That night, I wasn't afraid of the silence. It was my ally. And I knew that many more such moments awaited, where the world and emotions would coexist like 2 old friends.